All right, so in this video, I'm gonna give you 7 tips to help you paint flowers. All right, welcome to Paint Coach. My name is Chris Fornatero, and I'm here to help simplify oil painting so that you can get better faster. All right, painting flowers can be very tough, so here are 7 tips that I think will help you next time you try and do a floral painting. And actually at the end, I have one more extra bonus tip, so stick around for that. All right, tip number 1 is don't slack on the composition. You know, you might think, oh, okay, I got a vase of flowers, I'll set it down and I'll just paint it. You don't want to do that. You want to take the time to arrange an interesting composition. Now, composition is a giant topic, so I can't get into everything about composition. One thing that I can tell you, I guess this is kind of a tip within a tip, is when you're arranging your flowers, try not to have all your flowers the same size or distance apart. Now, yes, there's a bunch of other things you probably want to be thinking about with composition, but just having the flowers be different sizes and distance apart is going to automatically solve a lot of composition issues. For example, with this painting, I actually had 4 sunflowers, but I was like, you know, rule of thirds, odd number, took one of those out, and I kind of grouped 2 of them together and then one by itself to help the balance of the composition. I was also aware of this good diagonal leading us into the vase. I was also aware of the negative space. You know, we have 2 shapes here, you know, this big dark shape and this one smaller shape of the table, and I liked how they were different sizes. If they're both the same size, the composition wouldn't be as good. All right, tip number 2, when it comes to drawing out the flowers, don't get caught up in the details. You know, don't be worrying about drawing in every single little petal. Just worry about the big shapes. For this painting, I drew in the flowers with thin paint. That's paint thinned out with paint thinner, and I'm not worrying about painting every single petal. I'm squinting my eyes to get rid of detail and combine things into big shapes. I also try and use straight lines when I draw. That helps me get the correct angles. All right, now a little side note, if you struggle with drawing, like you don't know where to start, you don't know how to draw for an oil painting, I've actually made a Foundations of Drawing for Oil Painting mini course. It's a great quick way to learn what you need to know about drawing for painting. So if you want to check that out, I'll put a link to it in the description below. All right, the next tip is do a value underpainting. Now, this doesn't have to be some big elaborate process that takes a long time. You know, I did mine here with just burnt sienna and paint thinner, and the fact that I'm using just paint thinner is gonna help that paint set up and dry quickly, so I'll be able to paint on it right after I'm done. And I actually put a black and white version of my reference photo to help me with this value underpainting. So doing a value underpainting is helpful no matter what subject you're doing, but particularly with flowers, it can be very difficult to gauge the right values. You know, flowers can be tricky like that, the lights and the darks, and kind of gauging how light or how dark they are. So doing an underpainting is going to help you solve a lot of those value problems. So when it comes time to actually painting with color, you're going to have an easier time figuring out the right value of those colors because you've already mapped it out. Now, before we jump into color, if you struggle with color mixing, like if you have trouble mixing up the right color, or you go through a lot of paint trying to get to the right color, your colors get muddy, I actually have the color mixing video from my Foundations of Oil Painting course available for free. I'll put a link to where you can get that in the description below. All right, moving on to the next tip. Now, when you start to put in color for the petals of flowers, a very common problem that I see and that I was the victim of for a very long time is not making the darks in the flower petals dark enough. I don't know why, but for some reason, like the shadows and flowers seem brighter than they really are. So I actually a lot of times will purposely paint in the shadows and dark values of my flowers darker than I probably need to, knowing that I can always lighten them as I go. And it's a lot easier to lighten paint opposed to darken paint as you go. But when it comes time to put in those, you know, really colorful, powerful highlights of the flower petals, they're not gonna seem as bright and vibrant because the darks aren't dark enough. You know, something's only gonna be as light as the darks are around it. So, you know, if you don't get your darks in dark enough and to go put in their lights, and now your lights don't look good, and you're like, what's going on? Nothing's looking good. And when your values aren't right, that's going to hinder the form of your flower. So don't let that happen, and get these shadows of your flowers in dark enough. All right, tip number 6 is get the big value shapes first. Meaning don't jump in there and start trying to paint individual petals right off the bat. I know it can be very tempting, especially once you get to the lights of the painting and you can make kind of a perfect flower petal with, you know, one stroke of a brush. Instead, squint your eyes and try and just see shapes. A good example of what I'm talking about is if you put your photo into Photoshop and use one of the filters, like you use the blur filter to get rid of detail and allow similar value shapes to be compressed together that's how you want to see the flower at the beginning stages of your painting, because it's these big light and dark shapes that are gonna help create and establish the form of the flower. You wanna establish the form of the flower first. That way, when you actually do start putting on lighter values, details, indicating petals, you're not gonna lose the overall form and structure of the flower. Now, I've actually made a video talking about this exact thing with the blur filter, but with portraits, it's the exact same thing, and it's just getting back to the good fundamentals, you know, the fundamental of simplification. You see, portraits, still lifes, it doesn't matter. It's all connected through the fundamentals. All right, and the next tip is utilize the negative space. When it comes down to identifying individual petals or suggesting certain petals, I actually get a lot of mileage out of cutting back into the big blocky shapes that I first painted. You'll be amazed at how much you can suggest with just cutting back into these big shapes. All right, and the last tip is don't get caught up in every single little petal. You know, when it comes down to the final details, I'm really picking and choosing which petals I want to identify. You know, what I feel is important to portray the flowers the way I want. Now, this can be different for everyone. You know, maybe painting every single flower petal is what you want to do. That's completely fine. Just make sure you are using all the tools that you have to paint the flowers the way you initially wanted to paint them. You know, you're an artist, and being an artist is about making decisions and deciding how you want the viewer to view your painting and what effect doing certain things will have on the viewer. All right, and the last bonus tip is, whenever you can, try to paint flowers from life. When you paint from life, it's going to solve a lot of the problems that I talked about earlier in this video. You know, you're going to see the values better. And when you paint from life, it's easier to simplify shapes and paint more simply, because, you know, unlike a photo where everything is sharpened and focused, when you look at something, you can only focus on one area at a time. So it's going to really help you to study from life. And it's okay if you like don't fully understand like exactly what you're gonna get out of painting from life. You know, I was like that at first. You know, when I was first starting to paint, I was like, what? Why did, you know, what's the difference from painting from life? You know, I look at the red flowers in the photograph and they're red in real life. Like, what's the big difference? And there is a big difference. And I found the more I paint from life, the more it actually helps when I do have to paint from a photo. You just better understand how light works. That's kind of the only way I can describe it right now. Maybe I'll get better at describing it later on. All right, hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you want to try the full version of this sunflower painting tutorial, that is available on my Patreon page. I'll put a link to that in the description below. And if you want to see what I am painting on a daily basis, you can follow me on Instagram at Forza43. I'm Chris Fornatero, here telling you to go get painting.